Today we look at a very peculiar and interesting sword. It's interesting in terms of its design, which is rather unique. It's interesting in terms of its history, which is rather long. And also in terms of the many variations of it and the kind of the complexity of these variations, which can be a little off-putting for people who are beginning to figure out Italian swords. And it's this. This is a model 1871 cavalry sabre. And to not leave you on too much of a generic cliffhanger, I'll mention why these three things are interesting in my opinion. The design, I think you can see right away. You can probably see from here already, but it has a very unusual kind of grip style and how it merges into the pommel. We'll see all of that in detail close up in just a moment, but it's pretty cool. In terms of its length of active life, it's, well, still ongoing. This sword is still being used as the sidearm or part of the uniform of mounted police and carabinieri troops. So, if you're at any event where there's mounted police or carabinieri in their high uniform, you have a good chance of spotting one of these in the wild still today. And just to address the complexity in terms of variants and variations, official variants, by the way, of this sword, let me just tell you that its official name is actually model 1871/29, but this is often referred to in collector environments, in auction houses, as a model 1871/09, not incorrectly, because an 1871/09 does exist, and this can generate confusion because the 7109 is actually a variation of a model 1900/09. So we have a lot of dates, a lot of weird variations on the sword, and all of these can generate a lot of confusion. So today we'll take a look at the sword, but also try and unravel these variants so that it will be easier for you guys to recognize them, what they are when you see them. And perhaps a good starting point is actually to break down these differences. The original sword is a model 1871. The /29 has been added because there's a variant of it, which was introduced in 1929, which is really, really similar, so not different enough to warrant a new name, but also has some small differences that can help us at least place it in time. So the original 1871 is recognizable by this wooden grip. It's apple wood, by the way, which is, I think, an unusual choice. It's not one I've seen very often in terms of use on swords. And by the fact that the scabbard has one suspension ring. So, fairly straightforward, apart from all of the other specs that we'll see when we look at the close-up. The model 1829 came up with a couple of small differences. One, the scabbard adds a second suspension ring. So if you end up seeing one of these with two suspension rings, at least the scabbard is post 1929, if not the sword as well. And the other difference is that on the officer's version of the sword, the grip is changed from wood into ebonite. So if you find a sword that is exactly the same as this with a ebonite grip, you know that it's an officer's version post 1929. Let me now unsheath it because the blade is actually central to understanding the differences in the next variations we're going to talk about. The first I want to mention is the 1900/1909 sword. This isn't really a variation on the 1871, although it can confuse especially beginners because it can have a pretty similar hilt, so it can initially draw people into confusion. However, it's not a variation, it's a completely unique model. The 1900/1909 is recognizable because it has a grip that is kind of anatomically shaped, so it has a little bit of a bend to it. But why is it relevant to know what the 1900 and 1909 is? It's because the blade of the 1909 is, in some cases, re-hilted onto hilted onto 1871 hilts. By the way, I should mention the difference between the 1900 and the 1909, and this is material for another video, is that the 1900 was way too long to be really useful and was shortened into the 1909. Its blade is characteristic because it does not have this pipeback you see in this sword, and also it has a slight fuller that goes across part of the blade. I can't go into too much detail because I don't own one, so I haven't handled it. But It's important to mention this model because, as I said, some of these blades were then hilted onto 1871, 1809s. So why this was done? Calamandrei, in his book Storia dell'Arma Bianca Italiana, has a hypothesis or an idea, and it might be that it was a way to upcycle existing stock of hilts. So they had a bunch of these 1871s, and since the 1909 was coming, ideally, was supposed to come and substitute the 1871, why not, at least for the first batch or for transitional phase, reuse the 1871 hilt, slap on the new blades, and off we go. However, things didn't go exactly this way because for some reason or another, I don't know exactly, but I assume the 1909 didn't perform as well as it was expected to, so we stuck with the 1871, which, as I mentioned, is still in use today. To clarify things a little, because I know that there are a lot of dates here and a lot of variations in models, a actual 1871 will have this hilt that we're looking at now, and this slightly curved, flat pipeback blade. Its 1929 variant will have the exact same configuration, but the scabbard will have 2 suspension rings or an ebonite grip in the case of officers' swords. The 1900 sword is a completely different model, but is slightly reminiscent of this hilt. And it has a non-pipeback blade with a fuller, and it's straight, by the way. And it's only relevant because it's a scaled-up version of the 1909, which was the sword that was supposed to substitute the 1871. The 1909 is important because sometimes we find blades of 1909s on 1871 hilts. So if you find one with no pipe back, a straight blade, then you probably know that it may be an 1871/09. The reason why I mention all of this is that in auction houses and collectors' circles and online forums, you will often find this called the 1871/09, which is likely not correct because I think the majority of the swords you find around are actually the original 1871/29. Anyway, I hope I didn't fry your brain completely with all of these numbers and variants because it's meant to be just a quick overview. And instead, we're going to look at the 1871 and dive into it close up right away. Okay, so let's start with our close up. I think the first thing I want to show you here is the hilt of this sword. So you will see it has the typical drop shape that you will see even in previous swords, which in later Italian swords you have like 2 of these drops too, so it evolves a little bit. But this sheet metal kind of guard is something you will commonly see on Italian swords. It's a matter of preference, I guess, whether people like it or not, in the sense that it is a little bit full compared to, let's say, if you compare it to the French 1882, for instance, or similar British models. But honestly, I find it to be rather a beautiful design. I think it's very protective. It almost feels, I'm not going to go as far as to say it feels like a basket hilt. So when your hand is holding it, it actually feels very well protected. Could be better. The inside is definitely exposed, but it could also be definitely worse. Another characteristic, which is typical of many Italian swords, is this kind of protruding section here. There's almost like a notch. And this is, let me show it to you. If you're familiar with Italian swords, you already know what this is. But if you're not, this is worth mentioning. This is a, you see there's a section here to be able to place your thumb. So it's like a thumb housing, so to speak. And this is really comfortable in the sense that it automatically puts your hand in the correct alignment to hold the sword in the correct position. So this is something that is common on Italian swords. I have to say, I don't think I've seen it on any other swords, at least not in this kind of design. And I think it's a very, very cool element of Italian design. And while we're talking of design quirks, I think it's worth mentioning that Italian swords are a bit of an outlier compared to what you often see in other European swords, which tend to kind of imitate very successful models. So for instance, you'll have the fascina messer, for instance, and it'll be imitated by a lot of different countries. And this happens over and over. One typical example would be the British 1796 light cavalry pattern, which then becomes the Blucher and is replicated in many different countries. Italians aren't immune from this in the sense that, especially in the Napoleonic era, a lot of their swords are clones of French swords usually. But as the 19th century kind of moves forward, they start developing their own unique designs. So before we go into more detail, I just want to quickly show you some features of this specific sword. So you'll see it has a crossed out number and then a actual other unit number, suppose, not unit, but like an inventory number. So this seems to me like a 251, which has been crossed out, and then we have a 237, which is the last number in use, I suppose. This is kind of replicated, you see it down here, where we have a 235, so maybe actually, could this be a 5? I don't think so, but it's hard to say. But here we have, yeah, a 235, which has been crossed out, and nothing else that I can see. So the scabbard is a very solid steel scabbard. It's not by any means a light, flimsy kind of scabbard, the kind that would bend maybe when you walk through a door with it. So yeah, so definitely some care was put into the manufacturing of the scabbard as well. It has one suspension ring, at least on this model here specifically. And I think we can now unsheath it just because it's heavy to hold with the scabbard. So one thing I want to bring your attention to before we look at the rest of the hilt is the condition of the blade. If you look at this blade, it's in practically mint condition. Actually, I'll go beyond the practically. This is just some dirt here. It is in perfect, outstanding condition. And this is because the blade, I assume, was very well preserved within the scabbard. So many times people say to not store your swords in the scabbard. And that may be true if there's humidity, and that's something that you need to check because you never know. But in this case, I think I was very lucky because this sword had its leather washer, which was completely soaked in oil when I got it. The blade was still oiled, and obviously that this kind of sealed the scabbard for a very long time, and that way no kind of moisture, water, or rust was able to form on the blade. So it's just to say, obviously be careful when you store your swords and scabbards, but it's not a guarantee that it's going to be a problem. I'll also quickly show you the throat of the scabbard. I find it very beautiful and interesting because it has this wide kind of flare here, which makes it really easy to insert the sword when you need to. It has a small screw that kind of helps fix the spine of the blade in place, so it tightens the assembly. And I don't know if we can look. And so far as the scabbard is concerned, this is the things we have to notice. You'll notice my hands are really getting dirty as I touch it, and this is because I oiled the sword really well after I cleaned it. So yeah, so it's well oiled as it should be. So one interesting thing about this sword specifically is the hilt area. We already kind of looked at the guard section here, but I think maybe there are two very characteristic aspects of the hilt that kind of give it away, and I think are, well, they're debatable. I guess you could like them or not, but they're at least typical of this model. One is the wooden grip. It does not have a covering in like leather or fish skin, and there's no metal binding around it. And it's, if I'm not mistaken, this should be apple wood. So it's a unusual kind of wood, and it's also an unusual choice in the sense that it was designed to be exposed, and I think an aesthetic choice, definitely not just a functional one or one of budget, let's say. The other element I think is important here to notice is this step. This is kind of unusual in the sense that many swords you'll see have kind of a more organic pommel section to them, whereas here it kind of seems to interrupt here at the point where the guard connects to the grip. And then you just have this cylindrical extension, which is where the pommel cap here is added. So if we quickly look at the pommel cap area here, You'll see that it's not actually a pommel cap in the sense that it's not covering anything. The peen is visible there. So I hope it's in focus, but a rather interesting but also straightforward assembly. So we have a straight through tang, it's pinned at the bottom, there's no covering, there's nothing to disassemble, there's no thread or anything like that. If we look further at the grip, one thing that's kind of unusual, I think, compared to other models, at least on this version here, is that you often have a texture here. If you remember the Brazilian cavalry sword, the 1905, I think, model I showed, it had a texture here, like a checkered texture, because it helps hold things in place. Here we have a perfectly smooth and actually flat area on the grip. It does not make it uncomfortable at all, though. It's a very comfortable grip. And instead you have some checkering here, which I'm not sure if it has a functional purpose. I can't really see it being functional. It looks more decorative to me. But nevertheless, this is kind of the assembly you have. And then you have a notch here where you would have the porte-épée or some kind of lanyard would be fixed. Moving on to the blade, I think the most important feature I want to mention here is that it's a pipeback. So you see this round and rather thick spine section here, which continues fairly thick. I mean, basically up to almost the end. Like here it's still rather thick, so, and we're almost at the tip. And then we have a basically flat blade, so it does taper slightly. You have, it probably won't come through on pictures, but about up to halfway through the blade it's still rather thick, and then it has a further taper down towards the edge. But overall, this flat section here is way more flat than this pipe area here, which I mean is obvious given it's a pipe back. On this sword specifically, we also have some maker's marks. So we have a AC and S, which stands for Alex Koppel in Solingen, which you may think, wow, that's a really good memory and recognition of marks, but I'm kind of cheating because it's also mentioned here in its long form. So we have the full branding here. So double maker's marks on the sides. It's not razor sharp, but like I'm not worried about passing my fingers on it. However, if I were to be hit even by this blade without it being sharpened, it would probably cause some damage. Actually, definitely cause some damage. But it is not, let's say, sharpened for use. So this is the conditions it's in. The tip, we already saw it earlier, but I just want to mention it has a spear tip here. So it's a slightly curved blade. And then the tip kind of, I would say almost corrects the curve, a little like you would see on a clipped tip in a sense, where the end of the tip is kind of off the line of the curve. So it makes it easier to thrust. And as for the use of the sword, to me personally, the fact that the ridge runs up to the tip here, I feel like it is a good thrusting sword, which, I mean, would definitely cut, but I don't see it being a bad thrusting sword. It has some flex to it. Let me show you. There you go. But it's not nothing extreme. So it's a rather light and nimble blade for being a heavy sword, if that makes any sense. So I wouldn't say in absolute terms it's an agile kind of sword, but when you compare it to other kinds of cuirassier or heavy cavalry swords, this one definitely falls in the, I feel, more usable, more pleasant to handle area of the spectrum. So in any case, that's it for this sword. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have a chance to pick one up, I suggest you do, because this grip and hilt are just, for me personally, really beautiful and unique. And nothing, I'll see you in another sword video. Thank you for watching, bye. Oh, and before I forget, since this is an Italian sword, Matt Ford, author of La Sciabola, please check my review of his book, actually very kindly provided a downloadable free copy of his book. So please comment, let me know who's interested, and we'll do kind of random pick of a winner, and whoever wins will get the code to download the book free. So I hope you really enjoy it, because it's a great work of research. And again, see you soon. Bye.